promote you. Oh, now I'm not on mute. Sorry, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? So now I've just been able to look around the base of bed. Hopefully now you'll be able to hear me as well. Okay. You're not allowed to make Sikha on Pesach. Why are you not allowed to? What will happen is it takes time to make a design, and therefore become chametz. Maybe what he should do is get a stamp, a mold, very good, and then that way it won't take time, and therefore it should be mutter. Answers the Gemara, Kiven, you should do it in one shot, one go. This, by the way, is a phrase which the Gemara uses on a very regular basis. It's kedai to have the phrase, like, a bird in the hand is better than two on the bush, right? That's a phrase. So here's a phrase which the Gemara uses. That if we allow you to have matzahs which were made by a mold, so then other people will come to make matzahs without a mold, and they will end up with chametz. And what should you say? Matzahs which were made with a mold are good. Matzahs made without a mold is no good. But that's no good. Why not? Because people won't be able to distinguish. So they'll say matzahs which are made with a mold are permitted. Matzahs without a mold are forbidden. That will be too confusing. So therefore, we've forbidden all matzahs. So again, lechatchila, you never make matzahs in a mold, or even in a design, or in any way. If you did, the mutter b'diavad. So somebody would say to you, Yomi kol asvika nasun v'svika b'aisis mutorin. What's that expression signifying? What's the message? What's the gist of that phrase? What's the gist of that message? Very good. That sometimes we make a blanket gezeira because it's confusing to distinguish between one and another. So if you want to say like all things are forbidden, you'll say kol asvika nasun v'svika b'aisis mutorin. It sounds like a very strange expression, but that's what it means. We make a blanket issa that not to confuse people. Now the Gemara discusses this a little bit more. I went after my father, Tzaddik Beis and Gamliel. They view the father of Sikha with the Pesach, and they bought decorated matzahs. You're not supposed to. Yeah, it's probably using them all together. Bakers, they like to make very careful designs. Housewives don't care. So therefore, a baker may end up waiting and doing it in such a careful design that will come chametz. But a woman's not so perfectionist. So therefore, baker's design is forbidden. A woman's design is okay. Some say, bakers is okay. Why would a baker be better? Before it's baker's worse. Oh, because they're experienced, so they're quicker. And that's forbidden. You're allowed to if it's a wafer thin. We're not allowed to if it's thick. So we've got here quite a lot of different opinions. One opinion is not allowed to make any decorated matzah. One is that you're not allowed to make it if it's a baker's, because they're perfectionists. Some say you're not allowed to do it if it's a housewife because she's not experienced. And the Beis says you're not allowed to if it's a thick dough, because thick dough becomes chametz quicker. Says the Rosh, because we want to be machmir, we don't make any designs in our matzahs, and it's a very big word out of mechaber. Your matzahs have to be without any design. In fact, Mishpor himself asks, what about these rollers where we make it and they make holes? He says that's not a design, because they do it very quickly. It's not a specific design, and therefore it's permitted.
That's also to help it not rise.
It's making it not bloated. Right. What does it say? What? Brilliant. Now, there's a very big Yehuda on this Gemara. The Mechaber Paskins, if you've got the birthday cake and you write on it Mazel Tov Moishi, are you allowed to eat it on Shabbos? What's the Mechaber say? Mechaber says if it's written on, you're not allowed to. What?
In backgrounds, you can buy a plate.
Plate where you write the
And then you write it on there so you can save it, take it off on Shabbos.
Is that what they do?
Yeah.
You
have to say I want it for Shabbos and they make it.
Where they can come off.
Like a hard chocolate plate on the top.
Says the Talmud Mavova, I don't understand. How can the Mechaber say such a thing? The Gemara over here talks about designer matzahs. And designer matzahs. Oh, very good. So that's that. Oh. If it is the cake itself, it's a shape, that's permitted. If it's written on the cake, it's forbidden. So now it comes back to the question, which kind of matzahs are we talking about? Rashi says we're talking about matzahs where you actually draw a picture on top of them, which if that's the case, then the Yehuda's got a good time against the Mechava. But according to the Meiri that we're talking about matzahs, what?
She's have issues.
Oh.
Shabbos, breaking the writing of Shabbos.
Yes, I do, but how is he going to use this matzah on Yom Tov? The more we have discussed the problem of chametz. How could he just?
No problem now. I'm broken anyway.
But one final thing is like, which I want to say. So comes down machlikas, which kind of matzahs is whether it is the Chaznish finishes off. The Chaznish brings all this down. The Chaznish holds it's asa. And says, who says we're talking about Leila Seder? Maybe we're talking about the rest of Pesach, and he holds that you shouldn't break it. Oh, there's one final thing that is Taka. He brings. I saw it in the Sefer Zochar Shomim Falk. He says like this: that's only if it's writing, but patterns, that's okay. I mean, if you've got a cake which you've done let's say triangle or hexagon or Mogen David, that's fine. It's only writing with a chashash kosef amoichek. Okay. The reason to do with it is because by kosef amoichek, by design, it doesn't really, you're not eradicating the design by breaking it. By writing, you can actually delete or write with it. Okay. Says the Gemara like this. Talking about on a new topic. Now, with the halacha is that the halachas of challah and matzah are similar, meaning hafroshas challah. Whenever you make a dough, you have to give some to the kohen. Hafroshas challah. And because we learn lechem oini, and when you posket as lechem regarding making a challah, you make a challah dough, lechem dough. So therefore, if it's a bread for matzah, so it's a bread, then you have to take challah. If it's not for either. So talk about hasuf kunim. That's a dough which is like a sponge. Yes, or sponge is a sfog in there. So when you want to wash yourself with a sfog, sponge. Va'aduv shanim, honey dough. Vois keritin is wafers made with honey. V'chalas amaseres, which the Gemara will explain later what that is. Va'meduma, that is challah which has got truma mixed inside it. P'tur min hachallah. Now the Gemara is going to only discuss all of them except for meduma. Meduma is to do with a different reason. It's to do with the fact that since it's already got truma inside it, you can't take challah and truma for something which the Torah says you should take challah. Rashi brings the lashon milechem. Is it meduma? Tavimu truma. You should create truma, not something which is already truma. We're going to leave meduma. That's got to the problem of tavimu truma, make it in truma, not something which is already truma. But the problem is with the other four. What about the other four? My chalam says, first of all, establishes what it is. That it is something which is scalded. That means what you do, instead of baking it in an oven, you cook it in a pot in hot water. I think bagels are made like that. I must admit, I've never made bagels. You boil it. So again, challah, which is a sponge, or honey, or wafer with honey, or a boiled piece of dough. In all these four cases, what's the din? What's the din in all four cases? You don't take challah. Brilliant. You don't take challah. Oh. Says the Gemara, a big machlokes. Amar v'shlokish, halolu ma'aseh ilfasein. The reason for all these cases is because they were cooked in a pot. And a pot, the Torah says, challah is when you bake it in the oven. Something which is made in a pot is chayav. We're talking about when you heated it up in the sun. This is a very big machlokes of Yechon and Shlokish. Something which is cooked in the pot, do you need to take challah or not? Now, there's a machlokes of Shenim do pass like a Yechon and Shlokish. Does anybody know a Yechon and Shlokish should do pass like? Of Yechon, except for 3 places. The Gemara says there's only 3 places that will pass like a Shlokish. By 6. So the Chayur over here would pass like a Yechon. That's something cooked in a pot. You do have to. The problem is we're going to see that most of the future Gemara goes on the mahalach of Vishlokish. So because of that, many Rishonim paskin like Vishlokish. And they say that it's only when nobody else discusses it, then we pass on like a B'yichon against Vishlokish. But when other people discuss it, and they hold with a opinion of Vishlokish, pass on Vishlokish. Now, I just want to tell you a Binu Tam. This Binu Tam is brought down tens of thousands of times. At least on the Tesis Tam is down on base, the long Tesis. Binu Tam asks the following question, a sudistic question. When is a person mechuyev to take challah? He makes a dough. Asks of in your time, I don't understand. I make a dough mechayev challah, and then I fry it. Now I'm potter. When did it become potter? You already chayev. What? But again, if you would say the chiyuv challah came when I baked it, fine. So you could say I never baked it. Fine. But if the chiyuv of challah is like you all shout out, is the chiyuv is b'shas isa when it's a dough. So it's already a dough, it's already chayav. And what later I decided to fry it, it becomes potter. Doesn't make any sense.
The chiyuv is on what you make.
Must have been cow,
Not
yeah.
how you cook.
If it's making it, if you're making
So
a
again,
baking
so you're
dough-
asking over the
if
time
you're
where
making-
you,
if
What?
you're making a baking dough, then you fire.
oh, that's what the Reef says. And in fact, most of the Shem say like the Reef, that when your intention is to bake it, then the dough is chayav. But if your intention is never to bake it, but to fry it or to do other things to it, it's not chayav when it's a dough. So that even though at this particular moment, looking at it, it would be like any other dough. But because in my mind, I'm thinking to make out to donuts, and that's not challah, therefore I don't have to take challah. But Rabbeinu Tam disagrees. And Rabbeinu Tam says our whole Gemara, which says that your potter from challah, if it's fried, is talking about not a normal dough. It's talking about a very loose dough. So therefore, he says that if you make, for example, lokshan, or even the things that you put in your soup and things like croutons, whatever, you're always chayav to take challah, because that's a normal dough which afterwards you fry. That's what he says. So it comes out to double machlekas. One machlekas and three machlekas. Machlekas of Yehuda Mishlokish, something which is cooked in the pot. Do you have to take challah? According to Rabbi Yehuda, yes. According to Shlokish, not. We have a machlekas of passing like Rabbi Yehuda or Mishlokish. And furthermore, we have a machlekas. What did Rabbi Yehuda Mishlokish talk about? Are they talk about a normal dough or a loose dough? I had before, I don't know when notice when Paris brings a long story that Yehuda Paris used to tell his wife that whatever she makes a dough, which Rabbeinu Tam would say, you take challah, she should take without the bracha. Nowadays, in fact, you have to be machmir. I don't know if any of you made donuts over Hanukkah. If you did you take challah? You should take challah, because this is the machlikas. Okay.
It's not just that, the bakeries, when they make the big cakes, once it's baked, since it's stiff, there's enough flour in there
To make it challah.
crazy.
Okay. So now the Gemara is going to discuss machlikas v'echon shlokish. Basically, asufkenim, sponge bread, vadushanin, and honey bread, biskvitin. Also, be'ilfas. If you make it in a pot, chayavin. Mefush, not like a shlokish. Bechamo petur. Chuvti the v'shul melokish. Ola. Omalokish melokish. Ochma askinon shetiach l'seifetbek. When you make in the oven, what you do is you take a fire, put an oven clay over it. The oven gets very, very hot, and you put the dough on the walls of the oven. It makes it hot. If you do the same thing by a pot, that means you heat up the pot until it's very, very hot, and then you put dough on it. That's the same as an oven, and therefore you're chayav chal. When did the Shlokish say your potter? Is when you put the dough in and then you start cooking it. That is when you're potter. Says the Gemara, you heated it, then you stuck it up. But if you attach it and then you heat it up, then sorry, well, sorry. You say potter like a Shlokish. At the time you say for us on Bechama Petuin, why did Beis talk about case make it in the sun your pot? And if this talk about the same case, why talk about the sun your pot? Talk about a case you put in the pot, but because it wasn't hot and you heated it up in the pot, your potter. You have to add to the Beis. You have to read as follows. If you first you put it in and then you heated it up, it's as if you made it in the sun and spot. It comes out that even the Shlokish that says that if you heat up a dough in a pot, you're potter from challah, even the Shlokish would agree that's only if first you put the dough in and then you heat it up. But if you take a metal bowl and you put it on the flame, and the metal bowl gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then you put the dough over it, right, like a pancake or something, even with Shlokish would agree that that's called baking and you're chayav challah. Toshema. Now, we said always challah and matzah is dependent on each other. I wish to tell you that there's a tshuva from Shmuel Vosner regarding can you make matzahs with gas? We make matzahs with fire, right? But can you use a gas, let's see. No, let's say you've got your gas cooker at home in your kitchen. Put on it a Shabbos blech. Hopefully make a kosher Pesach one.
No, it's normally using wood to put.
No, they make usually a fire.
Wood.
What?
Just use wood. No.
Is that what they do in Bells?
I don't know about
No,
bells.
that's one sure.
No, he says.
No, Amish is good.
Good, and you're asking about gas fire.
I'm talking about gas fires. He says he's
no,
You heat it with gas.
So he says that if you heat up the metal plate and then you put it on, so then it's okay. But if you put it on and then you turn on the gas, it would be no good because that's what the says over here. Okay. Tell us about yotzim matzah hinam. You're allowed to be yotzim with matzah which is not properly baked. With a matzah asur be ilfos, a matzah which is made in a pot. So you see over here, like Rabbi Yochanan, because if we say that yotzim matzah in a pot is a vada that is considered proper dough, proper bread. If you hit it up and then you touched it. My matzah, what does it mean that it's not properly baked? When you've got matzah which is properly baked and you crack it, it breaks apart. When it's not properly baked, as you pull the two halves, strings of dough get pulled apart, like chewing gum of it. And then what happens is that's not baked. And if that's the stage, it is not matzah, and you can't be yotze your mitzvah of matzah. Again, so if you've got a matzah, you're not sure you got matzah, you're not sure if it's properly baked, what do you do? How would you know if it's properly baked? Break it and pull it apart and see if the strings are attached. Now, if you look at the bottom, Rashi says, I want to just go to the last 10 words. As long as the face crusted, then that's what we need. We need that it should cross over. So the Nid Yehuda again, Nid Yehuda, actually beside the Gemara, if you've got it, some people Gemara to the Chaim Pay, says that's not true because that's a different Gemara altogether. That means Rashi is telling us that this stage of the spreading is the same stage as crusting. When it crusts over, you should know there'll be no dough strings, which is difficult. The Shavuot brings Rashi, and he passes like Rashi. So therefore, if you see a matzah which is crusted over, even if you haven't been able yet to break it, you don't want to break it because you want to have a shalim for your Seder night, you are okay. The Shavuot also says a very interesting thing, that if you press your finger hard at it and nothing gets attached to your finger, that's also baked. It's quite important. Sometimes you do get matzahs. I get these oat matzahs, which are very stale and very thick. And when you press, sometimes you feel you wonder, are they properly baked? Are they actually baked? So these are 3 ways to test. Rashi's one about the crusting over as machlekes in the poskim. The Shmuel brings Rashi, so he obviously holds the Kamilah Rashi. So you've either got crusted over, or that when you break it, there's no strings pulling apart. Alternatively, that when you press it very hard with your finger, nothing comes onto your finger. It means dough, when you press dough, it sticks, it's sticky. Once it's baked or not.
Moisture comes on.
Moisture as well. Mishmar is sticky. Okay. The same halach is lachmei toda. They also have to be baked well enough that there's no strings. Pshita. It says lechem. So the table hol miksiv mimenu. Top of Lamed Zayin on Beis. Echad mikol kolman. Echad shnei til povus. You're not allowed to take a broken one. Bochman the priest of Daniel Kamashmal. Mean like this. You bring 40 loaves of bread for the common Torah. 1 out of 10, that's 4 loaves, you give to the Kohen as a gift. Can you give the Kohen broken pieces? Break half of one, half of another. Mutter asa, what's the din? Asa. You have to give him a whole one. You have to give him a sholim. So you might have thought, since the Torah insists on the sholim, these matzahs which are semi-baked, even though it is true that there's no strings, but they'll easily break. The better matzah is baked, the less likely it will break. So you might have thought for lachmei toda, since the Torah insists that it should be broken, it has to be properly baked. Otherwise, it will get easily broken. Kamash malon or not. So, Maisa, we were discussing in Machlekes Bichlon Mishlokish regarding dough which is cooked in a pot. Is it chayv and challah? Is it good for matzah? And we pass in the Maisa. Even Mishlokish agrees that if you heated it up and then you stick on it a dough, that's good enough for matzah. The Birch all sorts of that. The machlokes is only when you put it in and then you heat it up. By the way, we mentioned the Beis about semi-baked dough, and now we haven't mentioned that. Now we're going back to machlokes Birch and Mishlokish. Here you need to hold a bit of cup. Me'isa, the Gemara will explain in a minute what that is. So if you memorize it, according to Beishamai, Me'isa does not need to give challah. Beishamai say you do. Hachalita, Beishamai mechayim v'simon poitrin. It's the other way around. By Me'isa, Beishamai meiko, and by Chalita, Beishamai meiko. Ezu Me'isa, Ezu Hachalita. And Me'isa kebach shagabe mugloshin. What happened was you take hot water. The pan is bubbling with hot water, and you throw in flour. Chalita, what's chalita? Mugloshin shal gavi kemach. You've got flour in the pot, and you pour over it hot water. Now, the Gemara later is going to tell us that logically there's absolutely no difference between the two. Whether you throw flour into boiling water or boiling water into flour, logically, they should both be. No, because both times it's going to then continue bubbling in the pot. It's going to be a klivishan. I tell you, when you think about it, I don't know if any of you make it on Pesach, matzah meal with a bit of egg, kremzelech, whatever they call them. What? Matzah bride, things like that. This, what? So here we're talking about where you take not matzah meal, you're taking a bit of flour, take a bit of oil, a bit of eggs, and this is the mixture you're making. So we have got a contradiction a little bit, because we start off by me'isa, b'shama maker, and by chalita, b'silala maker, and really there's not much difference between them. The Gemara carries on. So far we've got two opinions, b'shamai, by me'isa, and two opinions of b'silala by chalita. Rav Yishmael, Rav Yisroel, Rav Shmuel, zev v'zeh lifto. That both of them are pot from challah. Both of them are chayav. Also, be'ilfas make it in a pot, potter. Betanu chayav in an oven is chayav. So there's 5 opinions over here by Meisa and Chalita. First opinion by Meisa is machlikas b'shama b'yisrael. By Chalita, machlikas b'shama b'yisrael. Then we have that both are potter. Then we have another opinion, both are chayav. And then we have an opinion that's nothing to do with Meisa or Chalita, both of them. If it's made in a pot, it's potter. If it's made in the oven, it's chayav. It doesn't make any sense, this price. Why by Meisa do we say it's chayav, and by Chalita we say pot according to Beishamai, and according to Beishamai the other way around? It doesn't make any sense. It's broken. That this brisa was misquoted, and in fact, you have to read the brisa from scratch differently. And in fact, there's not 5 opinions; there's only 3 opinions in this brisa. Let's start the brisa again, going back. The brisa starts off: Meisa b'shama say pot, v'sil say chayav. Chalita b'shama say chayav, v'sil say potter. Meaning like this: really, Meisa and Chalita is exactly the same. There was one opinion that b'shamai hold it's potter and b'sil hold it's chayav. And there was another opinion that Beis said Yechav and Mishamai says potter. There's no difference between Meisa and Chalita. That means either according to both it is potter, or according to both it is chayav. And then the next lashon which says Beis says in the name of his father Zev v'zeh lifto, that's either Beishamai or Beisilum. And the next random Zev v'zeh lechiv again is either Beishamai or Beisilum. So you've got 3, and then the Chachamim they make a difference. That means either Meisa and Chalita are pot from challah, or Meisa and Chalita are chayav and challah, or it depends if it was cooked in an oven or cooked in a pot. Cooked in a pot, it is pot. Cooked in an oven, it is chayav. Says the Gemara, but one thing we can be clear about is like this. It says clearly that if you make it in a pot, it's potter. If you make it in an oven, it is chayav. To Yuvta to Rabbi Yochanan, it's a kashan Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan, cooking in a pot, what's the din? It's got the din of challah. If it's got the din of challah, so what should it make a difference if it's cooked in a pot in the oven? And Tesis points out that you can't say that there's a difference between normal dough and Meisa and Chalita, because the Brisa continues that if you make it in the oven, you're chayav b'challah. So we obviously talk about the dough, which is chayav b'challah. Says the Gemara. So according to Kasha Rabbi Yochanan, answers the Gemara. Omloch Rabbi Yochanan Tanoi, it's machlekes Tanoi. I want to show you, let's read a few lines of the third Tosis. The Kulam Ma'aseh was returned. Pasuk Abinu Chananel Kavish Lokish. Right? The Kulam Ma'aseh was returned, just like we saw for the Beis Ma'aseh was returned. Oh, the big another more. The Kavichnon came along with the Chosh Barachilis by the Gimel Dalach Kavish Lokish Gabi Avichnon. That is not one of the 3 where we pass in like the Shlokish against Avichnon. So that's Machlokes between the Chananel and the whether we pass like a Bichl and Shlokish. And then if you go down a few more lines, Tesis brings down V'omer Avinu Tam. V'omer Avinu Tam is beginning of a line, about 15 lines to that Tesis. So Dafke Bivlosi Vaka Pigi, Davichon Sava Fios B'lo Say Lechem B'chad B'chalo. V'Shlokish Sava Inu Say Lechem B'Pota. Abelilosei Over Kuli Avamoy Do Techay B'chalo. Afil Alidei Mashka. Da'Chiv Chalav B'Mishas Gilgul. The chiyuv challah came when you don't make it into a dough. So therefore, says Rabbi Tam that if it's a normal dough, and even if whatever you do to afterwards, it makes no difference. Okay. So now the Gemara is going to bring a machlokes tanoim, which is a machlokes b'ichlem mishlokish. Onach b'ichlem tanoim. The Tanya. You might finish with chayav challah. Tamadoim on lechem, and it's not bread, so it's part from challah. That bread is only something baked in an oven. The Tanakhama said, you might thought it's chayav challah. Says the pasuk lechem, it's not lechem. Says Rabbi Yehuda, indeed it's not lechem, chayav challah, because it's not made in an oven. That's exactly what the Tanakhama said. If it's made in a pot, it is chayav. Rabbi Yehuda Sava myself is betuin. Oh, so what does it mean? When it says you might thought it's chayav challah. So Rashi explains like this: that the Tanakhama said as follows: you might thought isa v'chalita is chayav b'challah in a pot, kumash melon lechem, and this is a strange kind of dough, so it's not chayav. But if you take a normal dough and put it into a pot, you would be chayav. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda and says, no, even a normal dough, if you put it into a pot, you're potter, because it's not bread. Says, well, look, the kulam and myself is betuin. Everybody agrees that which is cooked in a pot is potter from chal. What happened was you took a piece of dough, you cooked it in water, and then afterwards you baked it into an oven. That's the machlokes Tanakhama Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanakhama said, lechem couldn't bake. Since at the end of the day you baked it, it's called bread. Bread is only something which is originally baked. Since it originally never baked it in an oven, lav lechemu. So the machlokes Tanakhama Rabbi Yehuda is in a case where you first cooked it and then you baked it. And therefore, according to the Tanakhama, you're chayav b'challah, because at the end of the day, since in the end you baked it, it is chayav. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're potter. They should bake the bread in one oven. It's in the teichachon. There'll be such a shortage of wood that women will be forced to share one oven. So we darshan like this: lechem ha'ofui b'tanu echad. Bread which is baked in one oven, kol lechem is called bread. The she'ein ofui b'tanu echad. It's not baked in one oven, ein kol lechem, it's not called bread. Let's just summarize a little bit. We've got a shaila regarding the chiyuv challah and the chiyuv of matzah. I mean, this will be a question whether you're chayav challah or matzah. The question is a bichel mishlokish regarding something cooked in a pot. Is that considered bread or not? Vishlokish agrees to Rabbi Yechilin in one case. Does anybody remember where does Vishlokish agree to Rabbi Yechilin that something cooked in a pot is considered bread? Where does Vishlokish agree to Rabbi Yechilin? When does Vishlokish agree to Rabbi Yechilin? Is if you heated up the pot and then you stuck the dough onto the pot, then Vishlokish agrees to Rabbi Yechilin. That is regarding a pot. And the same shayla is regarding matzah as well. Now, regarding something which is cooked and then baked, that's machlokes Tanakhama and Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not considered challah. According to Chachamim, it is considered challah. Regarding Isa and Chalita, we have three opinions. One opinion is that they're both pots of challah. One opinion is they're both chayav and challah, and one opinion is it depends if it's made in a pot or in an oven. Just saying, very by the way, one of the most amazing books I ever read was called "Playing with Fire." It's a woman. It's a bit. It's not about shtvol, but what happened was a woman that was Jewish, but she had no idea what Yiddishkeit was about. She lived in England, a true book, and she didn't know what Yiddishkeit. Her mother was Jewish, father wasn't. Her father was a very, very devout Christian, hugely devout. In fact, when she became from, he spent the rest of his life fasting every Monday and Thursday that she should come back to his religion. And she became a prophet in one of the churches in England. And she found it was all very, very empty. And she left it all and became full. Anyway, it's a fascinating book, Playing with Fire, very deep book. And it's interesting because years later, about 20 years later, after she brought out the book, Mishpacha had an article that it never sold well. And she was devastated it wasn't sold well. And she writes herself, the author, that maybe it didn't sell well because she talks so much about Yoshki. So therefore, the frum people were a bit put off. But it's actually quite a deep and clever book because she describes a lot of how she understood the difference in Yiddishkeit, the depths of the difference in Yiddishkeit. One of the things she writes, she knew nothing about Yiddishkeit, literally nothing. And she knew that she couldn't to Yidden that she's Jewish. And when she found that she was very, very empty, very, very empty, she decided to inquire by Yidden. So she asked a friend of a friend of a friend, can you tell me something about Yidden? So she said, I know nothing, but I know there's a Jewish bakery called Jinsky. I'll buy you some food from there, and then you can tell me. We bought bagels. What happened was it took weeks and weeks till it got to her because she was in some lonely Tumah church somewhere in England. The time she got it, they were rock hard. And she couldn't eat them. And for months and months, she thought that being Jewish means having very, very strong teeth. I thought it was hilarious. That's what she thought. That was the whole knowledge about Yiddishkeit, is that being Jewish is having very, very strong teeth. You should highly recommend it. I can't remember the name of the author, Play with Fire. You can Google it nowadays in a second. You can get a book. But the Beis, that is something which is actually cooked and then baked. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you will not be able to make hamoitzi on it. That is the problem. Maisa, because it's cooked, what they do is they take the dough, put it in hot water, and then afterwards they bake it, and then according to Rabbi Yehuda, you won't say hamoitzi. If you look at this taste, they're same tastes. But near Rabbi Yotam, about 10 lines from the thin lines. Near Rabbi Yotam, that you do make hamoitzi in all these doughs, and not like Rabbi Yehuda, by the way. We don't pass like Rabbi Yehuda. And if you get a bagel, you can make hamoitzi. I don't know if you ever eat bagels, but if you ever do, if you're Jewish, you have very strong teeth.
When the shop, they come like, you have to put water, you have to put boiling water, and then you can make them.
Oh, yes? Oh, wow. What?
Better nowadays.
So you can buy it, you dip it into water and then bake it.
Boiling water.
You should tell me, because I love bagels. I can't eat them. Says the Gemara very cool. Let's get right. Yosef, Rabba of Rab Yosef, Achayod Rab Zera. Rabba of Yosef sitting behind Rab Zera. Yosef of Zera made Ulla. So very briefly, Ulla was the Rebbe, right? Ulla was the Rebbe. He had the first row was Rab Zera, and behind Rab Zera on the last row was Rabba of Yosef. Now they were too scared to ask the Rebbe. So what they did was they wanted the person closer to the Rebbe, which was Rab Zera, to ask Ulla a question. So Amalei Rabba Rab Zera, boy name Ulla, ask him. If you stick it on the inside, and then afterwards you heat it up, you take a pot, stick it in the fire, and then afterwards you put the dough on the outside of the pot mouth. Omalei, he said to him, I'm not going to ask that question. It's a trick. You're asking me to ask a question from the Rav where the answer is obvious. My Amalei. What should I say to him? If I tell him this question, I knew myself. So why did you ask? Why did you want me to ask something which is shlokish? So Rabbi Yosef also was in the third row, if you remember. So he said, ask a different question. If what you do is you take a pot, turn it upside down, put the dough in, and then what you should do is, you put the dough inside the pot. And then what happens is you take a torch, a fire torch, and you light it on the dough. I want something read back. There's a very posh dessert. If you want to make it very crusty at the end, creme brulee. Oh, it's from my books. They take a blowtorch and then they heat it up like that. Right. So imagine you take a dough and then you blowtorch it to bake it. Would you say that that's called a Maisa oven or a tir? What? The problem is an oven is something which retains heat. You put it in an oven. Here, it's an outside fire. So Amalei said to him, what should I say to him? Should I ask him that question? If I tell him, that's how most people do it. Most people who are poor can't afford an oven. So an oven is very expensive. You have to have a lot of firewood. So what they do is they just take, let's say, an $1 candle, and they get the bread out, the pastry, and they put the $1 candle connected the bread, and that's how they bake it. So if I start asking such a question, he'll say to me, that it is, and therefore it's machlik zebich mishlokish. And if I didn't want to ask him, that means Zeva was reluctant to ask all the questions, which the answer was obvious. I want to do a little bit more, because if you've got a few more minutes. Omar Vasi, is this Ma'aser Sheni? What is Ma'aser Sheni? Very briefly, what's Ma'aser Sheni? Take it up to Yerushalayim and you eat it in Yerushalayim. If you can't afford, you can't schlep it, you put a money thing. Now there's a big machlokes. When you eat it in Yerushalayim, are you eating something which is yours? That means Hashem gave it to you. He said you can have it under certain conditions. You eat it in Yerushalayim, or is it really belongs to Hashem? But Hashem said you're allowed to eat it. My food. What's an afkimina? What's an afkimina? No, you're allowed to share it. What's the nafka mina? We've talked about this.
No.
No. We've said this a few times. What's the nafka mina? If you want to be Mekadesh an Isha, you go to Yerushalayim with a Ma'aser Sheni. If it's yours, only there's restrictions how you eat it to become Mekadesh an Isha. If it's not yours, and what's the nafka mina? Where else to have the Shaila? We actually talked about this over here as well. I got such pleasure. You go to a Kiddush. Imagine you go to a Kiddush. Come to a Kiddush. Make a Kiddush to Shabbos. And your wife, a woman is standing there. Somebody's no mechitza. You go up to her with a piece of cake. You say, "How's Mekudesh sleep? Does that work or not?" What would you say? Why not?
Yeah, the food's yours.
So that's the shaila. When you go to a Kiddush, we've asked this before. When you go to a Kiddush, is the food yours? Only you're restricted from eating it under certain circumstances. Oh no, of course not. It's not giving you the food. The food belongs to the owner. He's letting you eat it. What would you say? It's not yours. So you can't be Mekadesh an Isha according to you. So now, that's Machlok. That's Machlok is Tanoim by Beis Shedi. It's a hard shaila. It's a hard shaila. It's a hard case because it's got other nafki with us. Okay, we'll have to see a bit more. I'll just say, go to the mayor. According to the mayor, that says what? The Ma'aser Sheni belongs to Hashem. He lets you eat it, but tu benachalo. You're part from challah. Why are you part from challah? Because it says aviso seichem. Your dough. It's not your dough. Whose dough is it? Belongs to Hashem. Finally, let's carry a little bit more. Matzah shel Ma'aser Sheni. Matzah shel Ma'aser Sheni divrei Meir. Ein odom yitzvah dechvos bePesach. You can't use it on Pesach. Why not? Because it belongs to Hashem. Oh, who cares? The answer is because we will find a drosha that matzah has to belong to you. Finally, one more thing. We're going to discuss a little bit more, but I just want to point out that from this Gemara, there's a very big chumrah which all the people who sell matzahs are aware of. What's the chumrah? That you have to own your matzahs. And the Rishonim talk about, for example, let's say you didn't pay the owner before Pesach. So what happens is he doesn't really want you to have the matzahs until you paid for it. Let's say I come to you. Say, can you sell me? Give me some matzahs. Give me some matzahs. I'll pay you after Pesach. In your mind, you're thinking, until he's paid it, I don't really want it to be his. So can you be yotzi your matzah? No. So one of my sons, Baruch Hashem, a couple of years ago, learned about this. And now every year he says to me, I want you to be makna to be the matzah, but not on Pesach, because you can't be makna on Pesach, Erev Pesach. But then the problem is, it doesn't want that matzah, I should eat, and he should eat different matzah. So we have to separate the matzah. What? Oh, that's complicated. But they have to separate it. Oh, so this we're going to discuss a bit more. We're rushing out of time. Yeah, like chumas. I have to tell you, by the way, the Eliashiv also talks about it. Do you have to, if you've got guests, do you have to marinate tomatoes? No. It's not so posh.
Only the first night.